And now that we've generated this area of interest, let's go ahead and start building our flip source. So I'll start by dropping in a split SOP and connecting that to the area of interest null. And we'll start by just isolating the riverbed area, just removing the rocks for the moment. And if we take a look at the attributes on the rocks here, you can see all of the names are prefixed with rock. So we can use that name attribute to separate the rocks from the riverbed. So in the split SOP, in the group, I'll type @name equals rock star. Then display that. You can see that's isolating all of the rocks. I'll call the split riverbed, and then flip this to invert selection. And then we can generate a region that we're going to use to fill with water. And we're going to do something kind of similar to what we did to generate a temporary water mesh at the beginning of the class, but we're going to do it a little bit differently here. So I'll start by dropping in an extrude volume, and I'll set the depth to 5. So if you display that, you can see this is giving us just a big solid region where the water can exist, and this isn't really a good starting water mesh for us because this is also including the sides of the riverbed, and we really want this to be a nice clean region where we want our water to start. So this is just going to serve as a volume that shows where the water can exist. So let's convert this to VDBs with a VDB from polygons and display that. And then let's generate another VDB that will represent the water level. So I'm going to template display the area of interest here. And then I'm going to create a grid to represent the water level. And then on this grid, let's go to the gear icon and add a spare input. And then drag this area of interest to the spare input there. This just makes it a little bit easier for us to write expressions that refer to the size of this area of interest. So this grid is currently going to be just sitting at the origin there, and let's tell this to sit at the centroid of our riverbed region and fill up that entire space. And I'm not going to worry about the Y position of this just yet. I'm just going to center this on X and Z. So I'll drop in the centroid expression, point that to input -1, which is that spare input pointing to the area of interest, and then d_x for the x component of that center position. Then tab twice to get to the z portion, paste that in, and change dx to dz. Then for the size, I'll use the bbox function. Once again, point that to input -1, and then d_x size. Then copy that, paste it in for the second size component, and change that x size to z size. So now you can see that this is filling up the entire region for that riverbed. And then I'm going to do an extrude volume on this grid as well, but this one is going to be extruded downwards. So adding that extrude volume, we're going to set this to a negative depth. Let's display that. And let's set this to at least -5. The exact amount that you extrude this down doesn't matter too much as long as it fills the entire space of the riverbed. You don't have the riverbed popping below this at all. So now that we have this solid region that represents the water level, we can combine this with the other VDB for the riverbed to create a nice clean source. And then to combine those together, let's take this water level box here, generate a VDB from polygons from that, and display that VDB. And then next, we can combine these with a VDB combine, attach the water level VDB to the first input, the river region to the second input, and on that VDB combine, we'll set the operation to SDF intersection. So now this gives us a nice SDF that fills the entire river area nicely. Let's do a solid template for that area of interest, and then you can change the water level of the river by changing the Y height of this grid. So if we raise that up a couple units, we have a much deeper river, and if we lower that half a unit, then it's a much shallower one, but I'm going to leave this centered at 0 because I think this depth actually works reasonably well, at least for our initial river sims. And next we're going to subtract the rocks from our source volume here, because we don't really want to be creating source river particles inside all of those rocks. And the second output from the split for the riverbed is going to contain our rocks, so we can generate an SDF from those as well with another VDB from polygons. Connect that to the second output of the riverbed split and display that. And this VDB from polygons was very slow to generate because our rocks are extremely high res. As I've mentioned earlier in the course, you can feel free to use some lower resolution rocks if you want to. I may have gone a bit overkill for mine. And this took a little bit more than a minute and a half to cook, as you can see by middle mousing on the VDB from polygons here. But in any case, we now have a VDB for those rocks, and we can subtract this VDB from the water region VDB here with another VDB combine. So we'll connect our first VDB combine output to the new VDB combine, and then the rocks SDF to the second input of that, and set the operation to SDF difference. So this will subtract the rocks SDF from this water region here. So if we get rid of our area of interest display, this is our starting water region, and after subtracting the rocks VDB, now you can see those regions are cut out, so we aren't going to be sourcing particles inside the rocks. So this is going to serve as the source region for our flip, and we can generate the particles and volume from this by dropping in a flip source. And if you display the flip source, you'll see that this is creating some particles and a volume surface. Now we have a couple different ways that we can initialize a flip simulation. You can use a volume for this, or you can initialize it with particles. I'm going to do this with particles, but either way it can be helpful to just set up a split for the particles versus the volume. And we are going to use the volume surface here as well for some other things. Because the name of this volume is surface, we can use that to split them from each other. So I'll drop in a split. In the group, I'll select the surface, rename that split surface, and then drop a null after each output. So for the first output, this is an SDF that essentially matches what our input was. So I'll call this source volume, then drop in a null and attach that to the second output and display that, and you can see these are particles. So I'll call that source particles. And because some of this stuff was a bit slow to cook, particularly that VDB for the rocks, you could potentially put in a cache here if you'd like, so that you don't have to wait for all of that cooking anytime that you open the scene or come over to this setup. So I'll drop in a file cache, and in this case I'm going to put it after the VDB combine and before the flip source, so that we can change our flip source parameters fairly easily. I'll call this cache river source and set this to save out just the current frame. Turn on load from disk, point this to a river directory and call this river source.vo1.bgo.sc. We don't need to put a frame number in there because this is just a static cache, and let's save that to disk. So we have our source particles and source volume here based on a cached out source region. And we have some additional controls on the flip source for the resolution of these. So for my final sims, I went a fair bit higher on the resolution for the particles. I'm going to leave this particle separation for now for some lower res in the initial setups, but we will come back to this and turn this up a bit later. And now another thing that we need to add to our source particles here is an initial velocity. You could potentially get away without adding the initial velocity to this, but then you'd have to work a lot harder to get the river flowing in the right direction, and you would have to wait longer for it to start behaving nicely, whereas some nice initial velocity on this will make our lives a lot easier. And in this case, I don't really want to set just a direct linear initial velocity because this riverbed is turning a little bit, and I'd like the velocity to flow along the bends and turns of this river. So one nice way that I found to set up that directional velocity is to base it on a curve. So let's pull our current source off to the side and then drop in a null and connect that to the first output of the split riverbed. And we're going to use this to grab that riverbed so that we can draw a curve along here to drive that velocity. So let's back up until we can see the entire river in our viewport here. And I'll call this null riverbed. And after that, I'll drop in a draw curve SOP and display that. And on this draw curve, we can set the projection to be based on geometry so that we can draw on the geometry that we have running into the input of our draw curve. And then on the curve controls, we can turn off the width attribute and color and stroke attributes because we don't really need any of that information. And then with the draw curve selected, move the mouse cursor to the viewport and hit enter so that we can use our draw curve tool. And then starting at the top here, I'm just going to roughly draw this curve down the middle of the riverbed, trying to keep it roughly in the center of this so that it nicely matches the shape of the river. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as we're getting approximately the correct shape. So I'll remove the template display from that riverbed there. And you can see that we have this curve drawn and being projected onto the riverbed floor here. And we are getting a bit of a jagged curve due to all of the bumps on that riverbed. And this could be fine, but I'm going to smooth that out a bit. So I'll drop in a smooth SOP, set the filter quality to the lowest at 1, which is going to give us the most rough and broad smoothing, and then display the smooth. And it looks like the default strength is working just fine. You can see that if we leave the filter quality on 2, it is preserving some more of those kinks in the curve there. So this lower filter quality does help to smooth that out a bit more. And it doesn't have to be perfect, so this is totally fine. And the resolution on this might be totally fine as well, but just to make sure, I'm going to resample this a bit. So dropping in this resample gives us much more resolution along the length of that curve, which might not be totally necessary, but I'm going to go with that. And now we need to generate some velocity that's pointing along the length of this curve. So we can use the orientation along curve SOP, and if we drop that in here, and then scroll down to the output attributes, we can turn off this y-axis, and then the tangent z-axis is going to give us an attribute that points along the direction of the curve here. So we have this n attribute on the points there. And if you turn on the point normal display, we don't really see anything in the viewport here because those normals are pretty small at this scale and they're all going to be pointing directly along the length of the curve. So you can make those a bit more visible if you hover your mouse over the viewport and hit D to bring up the display options and then turn up the scale normal. Then you can see those normals stretching out much longer and you can get a better sense of the direction that they're pointing in. So let's template display our area of interest again and make sure that the normals are pointing in the correct direction. So I want the water to be flowing out down here where my riverbed kind of flattened out and I've added in these extra rocks here. And if I toggle the normal direction, it does look like this is pointing in the correct direction. If this is pointing in the opposite direction you want, you could drop in a reverse SOP and drop that in before the orient along curve, and that will point the normals in the opposite direction. But in our case, it looked like they were pointing in the correct direction here, so I'll get rid of that reverse. And then we can turn off the normal display for these points, now that we've verified that this is pointing in the correct direction. And ultimately, I don't want this attribute to be called n, so we could use an attribute rename or just change it in this parameter here. So that tangent attribute along the direction of the curve, we can change that to be called v for velocity. And all of these points are going to have a velocity with a speed of 1. So one way that we can change that is by dropping in the attribute adjust vector, which is going to default to processing the velocity v attribute here, and the default is to adjust the direction and the length, but I just want to adjust the length only. The operation I'll set to multiply, and if we set the constant value to 1, then this is going to have no difference on the velocities on these points here. If we turn on point velocity display in the viewport, we probably won't really see anything because these are pretty tiny velocity magnitudes right now. But similar to what we saw when we scaled up the normal visibility, if we start to crank up the constant value for the length multiplier on the velocities via this attribute adjust vector, then we should start seeing those velocities in the viewport. Let's get rid of our template display for the river and crank that velocity multiplier up quite a lot. So at 100, we're starting to see those velocities a bit more. At 200, those velocity trails are becoming a bit more obvious, and this actually looks kind of cool. So we can see that these velocities are working correctly, but I don't want nearly this amount of velocity. This is really going to be overkill if we add that amount of initial velocity to our particles. So instead of 400, I'm going to try a much lower value like 4 and see how that goes. And after setting this up, let's add a null here for clarity. I'll call this flow velocity, drop a net box around that, rename the net box flow velocity, and then we can transfer that velocity onto the particles. So to transfer this onto the particles there, we can just use an attribute transfer. Drop that above our source particles null, then attach our flow velocity to the second input, and on the attribute transfer itself, we can turn off primitive attribute transfer. Under the points, select the velocity only, and under conditions, we can turn off the distance threshold because we don't really care how far away from this curve our initial river points are. We want to make sure that all of these river points are picking up some velocity from the nearest point on the curve, regardless of the distance. So it's very important that the distance threshold is turned off, or at least turned up enough that you're guaranteed that all of the river points will find a point on the curve. And with point velocity turned on in the viewport, if we zoom in on some of our initial flip points here, you can see these are all picking up the correct flow direction. And now we've finished our initial source particles for our flip sim. Like I mentioned before, I probably will come back to this and up-res this a bit, but we'll leave it as is for a starting point, and I'll select all of this stuff and create a netbox around that and call this source flip, because as we add a whole bunch of more things in here, it will help to keep this all nicely organized.